He rejected his fated mate until she chose his best friend, and the Alpha King burned kingdoms to win her back, a true real-life story. There are some moments in life that split everything into before and after. You know them when they happen, not always right away, but eventually, you look back and you can point to the exact second when one version of your life ended and another one started, whether you were ready for it or not. For Serafina, that moment was a Tuesday night in the middle of winter. She was 23 years old, standing in a stone hall she had never expected to be invited into, wearing borrowed clothes because nobody had told her what to wear. The hall was full of people she barely knew, candles everywhere, the kind of silence that is not actually silence at all, but rather a whole room holding its breath at the same time. She did not know then that by the end of that night, everything would change. She did not know that the most powerful man in the room would look at her, and she would feel something pull in her chest, like a hook catching on a line, and for one single breathless second, she would think, "Oh, there you are." Like she had been waiting without realizing it. She did not know that he would feel it too, and then choose to throw it away. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. These things need to be told properly, from the beginning, or none of it makes sense. Serafina grew up in a small town on the eastern edge of the territory. Her mother had been a healer. Not a doctor, not a nurse, but a real healer in the old sense of the word. The kind of woman people came to in the middle of the night, with wounds that were too complicated for regular medicine and too embarrassing for a hospital. Her mother had soft hands and a quiet voice, and an ability to sit next to suffering without flinching that most people never develop no matter how long they live. Serafina learned everything from watching her. She learned that pain does not always announce itself loudly. She learned that sometimes the most hurt people are the ones who smile the most. She learned how to clean a wound without making it worse, how to tell when something was healing and when it was not, and most importantly, she learned how to stay in a room when every instinct is telling you to leave. Her mother died when Serafina was 19. Not dramatically, not in some terrible accident. She just got sick, and then sicker, and then one morning she was gone, and Serafina sat next to the empty bed for a long time before she understood that the person she had been trying to heal was gone, and that some things cannot be fixed no matter how much you want them to be. After that, Serafina had very little holding her to the small eastern town. She packed what she owned, which was not much, and she moved to the palace compound to work as an apprentice in the healing wing. It was not a glamorous job. She changed dressings and mixed medicines and sat with people overnight when they needed somebody to be there. She was paid just enough to eat and sleep and buy one new pair of shoes every 2 years. She did not complain. She had learned early that complaining was a luxury for people who had more options. That was the life she had built for herself by the time the night of the full blood moon came around. She should not even have been there, honestly. The blood moon ceremony was not really for people like her. It was a tradition that went back hundreds of years, when the pack first formed and the old bonds were established. Once a year, on the night of the full moon, the pack gathered in the great hall. According to tradition, the bond between fated mates revealed itself on that night if both people were in the same room. A glow, a warmth, an unmistakable feeling that even people who had never experienced it before somehow always recognized. Most years, nothing happened to most people. They stood in the hall for an hour, drank the ceremonial drink which tasted like burnt berries and old wood, and went home. But some years, a bond would reveal itself, and in the history of the pack, it had never once been wrong. Serafina had been asked to attend because one of the senior healers was unwell and could not be there, and someone needed to be on standby in case anybody had a reaction to the ceremonial drink, which occasionally gave people headaches or made them nauseous. She was essentially there as medical backup. She stood near the back of the hall, next to a wooden cabinet that contained her kit, wearing a dark green dress that belonged to one of the other apprentices because she had not owned anything nice enough for a formal occasion. The dress was slightly too long and slightly too loose in the shoulders, and she kept having to adjust it. She was doing exactly that, trying to get the left shoulder to sit right, when she felt it. It started in her sternum, like something warming from the inside, the way a coal goes from gray to orange when you blow on it. Then it spread outward, up into her throat and down into her stomach, and she looked up without knowing why, just following some instinct she had not been aware she possessed, and across the crowded room, through all those people in their formal clothes and their serious faces, her eyes found Darien Wolf. He was already looking at her. Now, if you have never heard of Darien Wolf, here is what you need to know. He was the Alpha King of the Ironclad Territory, which meant he was not just any pack leader. He was the leader of leaders, the one whose authority extended over 12 sub-packs and 4 border regions and more land than most small countries. He was 28 years old, tall and dark-haired, with sharp gray eyes that people said could read a lie before it finished being told. He was not kind, exactly, but he was not cruel either. He was precise. He treated everything and everyone as a calculation. He had been running this territory since he was 21, when his father died suddenly and left him a crown that was heavier than anyone had warned him it would be. He had never taken a mate. Not because no one was good enough, though some people suspected that was part of it, but because he had always said a mate was a personal matter, and he did not have room for personal matters. He had a territory to run. He had treaties to negotiate and disputes to settle, and people who depended on him to make decisions that were more right than wrong. So when he looked across that hall and felt the bond hit him like a door blowing open in a storm, his first reaction was not joy. It was something closer to panic. The whole room noticed. That was the terrible thing. The whole room noticed, because Darien was not a man who reacted to things. And suddenly he had gone very still, in the way that means someone is fighting very hard not to move. People looked at him, then looked to see who he was looking at, and then there was a ripple of murmuring that went through the crowd like a wave through water. Serafina felt the weight of all those eyes turning toward her, and she stood very straight, because she had learned from her mother that when you do not know what else to do, standing straight is at least something. Darien moved through the crowd. People stepped aside for him without being asked, the way people always did. He stopped a few feet away from her and looked at her for a long moment with those gray eyes that never seemed to stop calculating, and she looked back at him, and the warmth in her chest was almost painful now, almost unbearable, like standing too close to a fire. She thought he was going to speak to her. She thought he was going to say something, even something simple, even just an acknowledgement. She had not had time to prepare what she would say back. Her mouth was slightly dry. What he said was, "I reject you." The hall went completely quiet, not the held breath quiet from before, but the struck dumb quiet that happens when something so unexpected occurs that the brain genuinely needs a second to understand it. He said it clearly, the way he said everything, like a decision that had already been made and just needed to be announced. "I reject you as my fated mate. I release the bond. I release you from any obligation it carries. This is my choice, made freely, and it stands." The formal words of rejection. The ancient words that every pack member learned growing up, not because anyone expected to use them, but because they were part of the tradition, like knowing the words to an old song you hope you never have to sing. Serafina did not move. She did not cry. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and the warmth in her chest was becoming something else now, something that felt like pressing a bruise, sharp and nauseating, and she understood that this was what rejection felt like in the body, the physical reality of a bond being cut by one half of the pair. She did not give him the satisfaction of watching her break. She said, "Noted," in a voice that came out steadier than she had any right to expect, and then she turned around and walked back to the wooden cabinet where her kit was, picked it up, and walked out of the hall. That walk was one of the hardest things she had ever done in her life. She counted the steps, 12 steps to the door. She made it through all 12 of them before her knees started to give. She made it down the hallway and around a corner before she had to put her hand on the wall. She did not make it to the healing wing. She was found 20 minutes later by one of the senior healers, sitting on the floor of a corridor with her back against the stone wall, pale as paper and shaking. The pain of a rejected, fated bond was not metaphorical. It was real, physical, the kind that makes you understand why people use the word heartbreak so literally. She was carried to the healing wing and she spent 3 days barely conscious, her body fighting something that medicine was not designed to treat. Darian did not visit. Nobody expected him to. That was the thing about powerful men. The people around them spend a lot of time justifying their choices after the fact. In the days that followed the ceremony, the palace was full of quiet conversation about why the Alpha King had done what he did. Most people settled on the political explanation because it was the most comfortable one. There was a treaty, a formal alliance with the Western Territory, sealed by a promised marriage between Darian and the daughter of the Western Alpha. The arrangement had been in place for 2 years. It was not a love match, everyone knew that, but it was a strategically important one. The Western Territory controlled 3 mountain passes that the ironclad pack needed access to for trade, and the Western Alpha had made it very clear that the arrangement was conditional on the marriage actually happening. If Darian had accepted the bond, the treaty would have collapsed. The Western Alpha would have seen it as a betrayal. The trade routes would have closed. Real economic consequences for real people. That was the justification. And it was not even wrong, exactly. The consequences were real. The calculation was real. What people did not say out loud, at least not where anyone important could hear them, was that the calculation could have gone the other way. Treaties can be renegotiated. Political alliances can be rebuilt. A fated mate bond is one of the only things in the known world that genuinely cannot. But Darian was a man who had always trusted the thing he could plan over the thing he could only feel, and he had made his choice. The person who visited Serafina during those 3 days was Caden. Caden was Darian's best friend, and his beta, which in their world meant something close to a second in command, the person the Alpha trusted most, the one who stood closest to the throne without sitting on it. He was 2 years older than Darian, broader in the shoulders, with dark brown eyes and a way of moving through a room that did not demand attention the way Darian's did. He was the kind of man you noticed gradually, rather than immediately, warm where Darian was cool, easy to talk to where Darian was difficult to read. He had been in the Great Hall that night. He had watched what happened. He had watched Serafina walk out, and then he had gone home, and then he had come back to the palace the next morning and gone straight to the healing wing. He sat in the chair next to her bed and did not say anything, because there was nothing to say. He just stayed. The senior healer told him he did not have to, and he said he knew, and he stayed anyway. The second day he brought a book and read it quietly in the corner. The third day he was there when she opened her eyes. She looked at him for a moment, confused, because the last face she had expected to see was his. "You have been here the whole time?" she asked, and her voice came out rough and low from 3 days of barely speaking. "Not the whole time," he said. "I went home to sleep. But yes, most of it." She did not ask him why. She did not have the energy, but she remembered it. She went back to work after 2 weeks, because she needed to, and because she did not know what else to do with herself. The palace was not a comfortable place to be after what had happened. People either looked at her with too much pity, or not quite at all, which was its own kind of unkindness. She learned to move through it quietly, to keep her eyes slightly down and her pace steady, to give people as few opportunities to make her feel small as possible. Darian she saw occasionally in the corridors, or from across a courtyard. He did not ignore her, which she had expected. He looked at her directly when their paths crossed, with an expression she could not read and did not try to. She looked back without giving anything away, and they moved on in opposite directions, and that was the shape of it for many months. The treaty marriage went ahead in the early spring. Darian married a woman named Isadora, who arrived from the Western Territory on a gray morning with a long retinue of attendants, and a face that gave nothing away at all, which meant the two of them were at least matched in that respect. The ceremony was held in the Great Hall, which had been transformed with white flowers and silk draping, and all the palace staff were required to attend as witnesses. Serafina stood in the back, in her usual place near the wall, in her work clothes because she had come directly from the healing wing. She watched the whole thing happen with a steadiness that cost her more than anyone in the room understood. She stood straight. She did not leave early. She watched Darian say the words, and she watched him put the bond mark on Isadora's wrist, and she felt the last small thread of something still soft in her chest finally go quiet. It was not like losing something. It was more like finishing grieving something you had already lost, like putting down a weight you had been carrying so long you had forgotten it was heavy. She went home that evening and sat at the small table in her room and ate a bowl of soup and felt, for the first time in months, something that was almost close to peace. Not happiness, just the quiet that comes after a storm passes. The thing about rebuilding yourself is that it is rarely dramatic. There is no single moment where you stand up and declare that you are healed. It happens the way mornings happen. You wake up and it is slightly less heavy than the day before, and then slightly less than that, and one day you realize you went a whole hour without thinking about it, and then a whole morning, and eventually you stop counting. For Serafina, the rebuilding was mostly work. The healing wing became the thing she poured herself into. She was genuinely gifted at it, and the more she practiced, the more apparent that gift became. She had her mother's steady hands and her mother's ability to read pain before the patient said a word. But she also had something else, something she had not known she possessed until she was working alone one night with a patient who had a wound that would not close, a deep slash across the forearm that had been treated twice already and kept reopening. She had sat with him for a long time, frustrated, going through everything she had been taught, and then without quite deciding to, she had placed both her hands over the wound, and she had concentrated on something she could not fully describe, something that felt like warmth, but moved like intention, and under her palms, the wound had closed, cleanly, completely, in a way that should have taken weeks. She had stared at her own hands for a long time after that. She told one person, Caden. By that point, he had become someone she talked to regularly. It had happened the way slow things happen, without anyone planning it. He passed the healing wing in the mornings, when he was doing his rounds of the eastern wing of the palace. She was usually there, usually busy, but they had started nodding in acknowledgement, and then exchanging a few words, and then one morning he had stopped, and sat on the bench outside the healing wing, and they had talked for 40 minutes about something entirely unimportant, and that had been that. A friendship had started. He was easy to talk to in a way she had not expected from someone who occupied such a close position to the alpha. He did not perform authority. He did not talk over her or explain things she had not asked him to explain. He asked questions and actually waited for the answers, which was rarer than people realized. When she showed him what she could do, he did not look scared, or confused, or suspicious. He looked at her like she had just said something profoundly obvious that he was only now understanding. "That is why you are so good at this," he said, simply. "You are not alarmed? Should I be?" She thought about it. "No," she said. "Then I am not," he said. "But Sarah, this is extraordinary. You know that, right? You are not strange. You are exceptional. There is a difference, and the difference matters." She had not had anyone call her exceptional before. She did not know how to receive it. She looked away, out the window, at the winter courtyard where the trees were bare and gray, and she did not say anything, but she held the word in her mind for a long time afterward. Darian noticed the friendship. He would have had to be considerably less observant than he was to miss it, and one thing Darian had never been was unobservant. He told himself it did not matter. He was a married man. He had made his decisions with full knowledge of their consequences. Serafina was a palace employee, and Caden was his beta, and there was nothing about two people being friends that was any of his business. He told himself this regularly, which, if you think about it, suggests that he was having to work quite hard to believe it. The first time the thought crept in that he did not want to examine directly, he was in a council meeting, and Caden came in late, which was unusual, and explained that he had stopped to help Serafina carry some supplies to the eastern storeroom. The council moved on. Darian moved on. But for the rest of that meeting, some part of his mind kept replaying the simple ordinariness of the explanation. Caden had stopped to help her carry something, not because it was his duty, because he had wanted to. Darian went home to his chambers that night and sat in the dark for a while. He was not the kind of man who sat in the dark. He made a note of this and filed it somewhere he was not planning to look at soon. His marriage to Isadora was exactly what both of them had signed up for, which was to say it was a functional arrangement that occasionally resembled warmth without ever quite achieving it. They were polite to each other. They fulfilled their respective roles. Isadora was intelligent and composed, and ran the formal social obligations of the palace with a precision that Darian genuinely respected. He did not love her. He did not think she loved him. They had never said this to each other and did not need to. It was a life. It was even, in some ways, a good life, full of purpose and structure and the particular satisfaction of running something large and complicated reasonably well. He had no cause for complaint. He was just very, very aware, in a way that lived below his ability to fully articulate, that something was missing. Spring turned to summer, and summer to autumn. The months moved the way months do when you are working hard and keeping busy. Serafina was given more responsibility in the healing wing. She was training 2 junior apprentices now. She had her own small room that she had slowly, over many months, turned into something that felt like hers. She had a shelf of books and a small plant on the windowsill, and a blue ceramic mug she drank her morning tea from every day without exception. She laughed more. That was the main thing people who knew her noticed, not loudly or often, but genuinely. She had the kind of laugh that arrived unexpectedly, sudden and unguarded, and it changed her face completely. Caden made her laugh most often. He had a dry, unhurried sense of humor that worked on her exactly because he did not seem to be trying. He said things under his breath during council dinners that she was not supposed to hear from her position near the back, and she spent a dangerous amount of time suppressing smiles she could not explain. He also brought wildflowers, not dramatically, not as a declaration. They would just appear on the windowsill of the healing wing, or on the bench outside, or tucked into the handle of her kit bag. No note ever. She never asked him about it directly, and he never offered an explanation. But once, passing him in the corridor, she caught the slight satisfied look on his face when he noticed she had one of them in the buttonhole of her work coat, and they both pretended not to see it, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. She was not looking for this. She had been very careful not to look for anything. After the night in the Great Hall, she had decided, quietly and without drama, that she was going to stop waiting for her life to arrive, and start building one instead. The friendship with Caden was part of that life. She had not planned for it to become something else. She was not sure exactly when it did. The border war started in the first week of autumn. A rival pack from the northern highlands had been pushing at the eastern boundary for 2 years, small skirmishes that never quite escalated, the kind of conflict that eats at a territory like a slow leak. Then, in the first week of the 7th month, they stopped testing and simply attacked. Darian sent Caden to lead the defense of the eastern flank, because Caden was the best tactical mind in the territory after Darian himself, and Darian needed to stay in the capital to manage the political side of things, which was its own kind of battle. The first week of the conflict went reasonably well, meaning nobody important died and the eastern boundary held. The second week was harder. The northern pack had brought reinforcements that the intelligence reports had not accounted for, and the ironclad forces were stretched. Caden was wounded on the 4th day of the second week, not in a small way. He was hit during a breach of the eastern camp's perimeter, in the early hours of the morning, a coordinated attack that was designed to confuse and disorient rather than destroy, and in the chaos of it, he took a wound to the side that should have been immediately addressed, and was not, because the camp healer had been injured themselves, and the junior healers were overwhelmed. By the time someone got to him, the wound had gone bad in a way that was serious, the kind of serious where people stop meeting your eyes. A message was sent to the capital. Serafina was not officially on the list of people who were notified. She found out because one of the junior apprentices overheard a messenger in the courtyard and mentioned it in passing, the way people do when they are reporting news without quite understanding the weight of it. Serafina was in the middle of changing a dressing when she heard. She finished the dressing. She did it carefully and correctly, the way her mother had taught her. Then she went to the senior healer and said she needed a horse and an escort, and she needed them now. "This is not a formal deployment," the senior healer said. "I am aware," said Serafina. "Give me a horse." She rode 6 hours. The last 2 were in the dark, and the escort she had been given kept telling her they should stop and wait for daylight, and she kept saying no. She knew, in a way she could not explain and did not try to, that time mattered. The knowing sat in the same place in her chest where the bond had been, that same hollow ache, only now it was speaking a different language. She found the eastern camp shortly after midnight. A young guard tried to stop her at the perimeter, and she said her name and her rank, and the word healer, loudly enough that somebody with authority came to see what the noise was, and she was taken to the command tent. Caden was on a cot in the back half of the tent. He was conscious, which was better than what she had feared, but only just. The wound was exactly as bad as she had expected. The camp healer, arm in a sling, told her what had been tried and why it had not worked, and Serafina listened carefully and asked 3 specific questions, and then asked everyone except one support apprentice to leave the tent. She worked for 2 hours, properly first, using every conventional technique she had, methodically, the way her mother had taught her, because you always try the known things before the unknown. But the wound was not responding to the known things, and Caden's color was getting worse, and at some point in the 2nd hour she made a decision without quite deciding it, and she put both hands over the wound and did the thing she had only ever done alone, in the quiet of the healing wing, with nobody watching. It took longer than it had before. It was harder. This was not a clean cut on a forearm. This was something deep and complicated and infected, and it resisted. She held on. Her hands shook. She pushed past the shaking. She held on until she felt the thing shift under her palms, the slow, impossible yielding of damaged tissue finding its way back to what it was supposed to be. When she lifted her hands, she was dizzy, and her vision had gone slightly gray at the edges. The apprentice caught her arm before she could fall. Caden's breathing had steadied. She sat down on the floor of the tent and put her head between her knees and breathed until the gray went away. When she looked up, Caden's eyes were open and on her. "You came," he said. His voice was rough and low and completely unguarded in the way that pain strips people of their defenses. "Obviously," she said. She was still on the floor. She did not have the energy to get up yet. "I did not think you would know. Aya told me." "I will remember to thank Aya." Silence. She was looking at her own hands in her lap. They had stopped shaking. They looked normal, which was remarkable, given what they had just done. "Sarah," he said. His voice was quieter now. She looked up. "I need to say something," he said, "and I need to say it now, while I am still too tired to talk myself out of it." She waited. "I think I have been in love with you for a long time," he said. "I do not know the exact date it started. I think it was somewhere around the day you told the senior council that the eastern water supply was contaminated, and you had the test results to prove it, and if they did not act you were going to the settlement council directly, and you said it so calmly, and they backed down, and you walked out and ate an apple. I think it was that day. I think I looked at you and thought, this is a remarkable person, and then I tried to stop thinking that, and I could not." She looked at him for a long time. "I am telling you now," he said, "because I almost died tonight, and I find I am very tired of carrying things quietly." "I know," she said, not dismissively, gently, like she had heard what was underneath the words as well as the words themselves. "The thing with Darian," he said, and stopped, and then said, "I know it is complicated. It is less complicated than it was," she said. "He made a choice. I made peace with it. Those are 2 separate things, and they both happened, and neither of them is relevant to this tent right now." "Then what is relevant?" She was quiet for a moment. The lamp was burning low. Outside the tent she could hear the distant sounds of the camp settling after the night's chaos. She felt, sitting on the floor of that tent, more awake than she had felt in a long time. "What is relevant," she said, "is that you are alive, and that I rode 6 hours in the dark to make sure of it, and that I would like you to not almost die again for as long as possible, because I find I am also tired of carrying things quietly." He was quiet. Then, very slowly, his hand found hers on the canvas floor of the tent, and she let it, and they sat like that until he fell asleep, which did not take long. The message reached Darien the next morning. He was in his war council when a rider arrived from the Eastern Front with a status report. The status report contained, buried in the second page, the information that Serafina had arrived at the Eastern camp and was responsible for the Beta's recovery. The council continued discussing supply lines. Darien listened and responded, and made 3 decisions in the following 20 minutes that were by any measure correct decisions. But a different part of his mind had gone very quiet around the information in the second page of that report and was sitting with it in a way that was uncomfortable and would not be ignored. After the council, his general approached him with further updates from the east, and Darien listened, and then he said, "Is she still at the front?" The general, who had learned not to look surprised by anything the Alpha King said, "As of this morning, yes. She is treating the wounded, and says she will stay until the camp healer is recovered enough to resume duty." "And Caden?" "Recovering. The riders say it is remarkable. The wound should have taken weeks. It is already showing 3 days of healing." "Yes," said Darien. He said it like he was confirming something he had already known, which was not quite true, but was not quite false either. He returned to his chambers that night and stood at the window for a long time. Isadora was in the adjoining room. He could hear the soft sounds of her moving about, getting ready for sleep. He stood there looking at the city spread out below the palace, and he let himself think something he had been managing not to think for quite some time. He thought, "I made a mistake." And then he thought, "It is too late." And then, which was the one he could not manage to follow by another thought, "Is it?" He rode to the Eastern Front himself 4 days later, officially, to review the military situation. The general who had briefed him said nothing. Caden, when he was told the Alpha King was coming, looked out the tent flap at the gray autumn sky and said nothing either. He had his own feelings about this visit, and they were complicated, and he had decided to wait and see before he said anything to anyone. Darien arrived at midday. He did the military review. He was thorough and correct and asked the right questions, and the soldiers felt, as soldiers always did around him, that someone with actual authority and actual competence was paying actual attention to their situation, which was steadying. Then, in the late afternoon, he found Serafina. She was outside the medical tent, washing her hands at a basin. She heard him coming, because she had always been attuned to the sound of approaching things, and she turned before he spoke. She did not look startled. She looked like a person who had been expecting this, which did not make it easier for him. "I would like to speak with you," he said. "All right," she said. She dried her hands. She followed him to a quieter space near the edge of the camp, where the noise from the main area was reduced to a low murmur. He had prepared nothing. He had ridden 4 days composing things in his head and discarded all of them. He stood with her in the thin autumn light and said what was actually true. "I have been thinking about that night," he said, "the night of the ceremony. I have been thinking about it more than I have allowed myself to admit." She waited. "The choice I made was a rational one," he said. "The treaty was real. The consequences were real. I stand by the logic of it. What I do not stand by is the certainty I felt at the time that logic was enough." He paused. "It was not enough. I discovered that over time, quite slowly, which is the most inconvenient possible way to discover something important." She was looking at him steadily. She had her arms loosely crossed, not defensive, just that, her default way of standing when she was thinking. "I know that you have built something here," he said. "In the time since. I have watched that happen. I know that whatever you feel now, it is not the same thing you felt that night." He took a breath. "I am not asking you to go back. I do not think a person can go back. I am saying that I understand what I discarded, and that understanding cost me more than I expected it to, and I am saying it to you because you deserve to have it said." She was quiet for a moment, The wind came through the trees at the edge of the camp. A late leaf fell somewhere to their left. "I believe you," she said. Her voice was not hard. It was not soft either. It was measured, the way someone speaks when they have thought about something enough times to stop feeling it as sharply. "I believe that you mean it. I believe that you understand now what you did not understand then." She paused. "I also want you to understand something. The woman who stood in that hall and waited for you to say something kind was a woman who would have accepted much less than she deserved. She was surviving, not living. What happened that night was the worst thing that had happened to me up to that point. And it was also the thing that forced me to stop surviving and start actually building a life." He listened without interrupting. "I forgive you," she said. "I want to be clear about that, because I think you may have been carrying the question of whether I do, and I want to take that off the table. I forgive you. I do not carry it. But forgiveness and returning are not the same thing. You did not hurt me and then stay. You hurt me and then married someone else, and then watched me heal from a comfortable distance, and have now arrived because the healing did not go in the direction you assumed it would. That is not a story where I am the person who goes back." She met his eyes directly. "I have chosen, not against you, for myself, and for someone who showed up when you did not. That is not a choice I am making lightly, and it is not one I am going to unmake." Darian stood there for a long moment. He was not a man whose face gave much away, but in that moment, something crossed it that was close enough to pain that any fair witness would have called it by that name. "I understand," he said. "Good," she said. She said it gently, not triumphantly, just with the quiet finality of a woman who has made her peace. He rode back to the capital the next morning, alone in the sense that he did not bring unnecessary company. He was quiet the whole way, in the way that suggested not the absence of thought, but a surplus of it, all of it moving too slowly to escape. The political crisis arrived 6 weeks after the border conflict ended. It arrived, as political crises often do, from a direction nobody had been watching carefully enough. Lord Varick was the ruler of the Ashfen court, a separate and ancient territory to the south, loosely allied with the ironclad pack, but never entirely trustworthy. He was the kind of man who mistook wealth for power and power for the right to demand things, which is a common and consistently costly mistake. When news of Serafina's abilities reached him, which it did because secrets rarely stay contained when they are interesting enough, he sent a formal envoy to the ironclad palace. The envoy was polite in the way that knives are polite, very clean, very precise, and clearly designed to cut. The message was simple. The woman known as the Soul Healer, Serafina Cole, was to be made available to the Ashfen court. Not requested, made available, as in Varick expected to receive her, and this expectation was not framed as a negotiation. The implied alternative was war. 3 territories that Varick had alliances with bordered ironclad land. The threat was never said directly, because the most effective threats often are not. The envoy was received by the palace council in the morning. By the afternoon, Darian had been briefed. By the evening, the envoy was on his way home. Darian had sent him back without an answer, not because he needed time to think, because what he had to say in response required more than a message. He arrived at the gates of the Ashfen court 2 days later, not with a diplomatic delegation, with his full war force, which in practical terms meant several hundred of the most experienced fighters in the territory, arrayed behind him in a way that was visually unambiguous about their purpose. Lord Varick came to the upper gate when he heard. He stood on the parapet and looked down at the Alpha King standing in the road below him, unhelmeted in the cold morning air, looking like a man who had already decided every step of what was going to happen next. Darian looked up at him and said, clearly enough to carry, "She does not belong to anyone but herself. She is not a tool to be transferred, a resource to be allocated, or a prize to be demanded. She is a person, and she has made her own choices about where she is and who she is with. You will not send another envoy. You will not issue another demand. If the word soul healer crosses another courier's lips in a message addressed to this court, I will interpret that as the opening of a conflict you do not have the capacity to survive. That is not a negotiating position. That is the only thing I am going to say to you on this subject. It applies now, and it applies permanently. Do we understand each other?" Varric stared down at him for a long moment. People who knew Varric well said later that he had, in his long career of strategic aggression, genuinely never been spoken to like that. He had calculated, not entirely incorrectly, that the Alpha King would not risk a three-territory conflict over a palace healer. What he had not calculated for was that the Alpha King had apparently stopped doing the kind of calculation that would lead to that conclusion. Varric said, "We understand each other." Darien turned and walked back to his forces, and the army turned around, and they rode home. The story spread faster than news usually does, which is saying something. By the end of the week, it had reached every major court and pack on the continent. The Alpha King had ridden to the Ashfen gates and threatened a three-territory war to protect a palace healer, not his queen, not a treaty, a person who had not asked to be protected and, by all accounts, had not been informed it was happening. Serafina heard about it the same way everyone else did. A junior apprentice mentioned it while they were working, and she went very still for a moment, and then continued what she was doing. Later, sitting alone in the healing wing after the day's work was done, she let herself think about it properly. She was not, she noticed, surprised. She was something more complicated than surprised. She sat with the feeling for a while without trying to name it. Caden found her there. He had heard too, obviously. He sat down across from her, and they looked at each other. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said, and then, honestly, "I do not know what to do with it." "You do not have to do anything with it," he said. He made a choice. It was his choice to make. It does not require anything from you. "I know," she said. She looked out the window at the night courtyard. "I think the thing is that I understand why he did it, not because of what it means about us, because of what it means about him. He has spent his whole life treating everything as a calculation, and somewhere in this past year he stopped doing that for one thing, and it was for me, and I do not know what to do with the complicated sadness of that." The sadness that he learned it too late? Yes, exactly that. Caden was quiet for a moment. He was watching her the way he often did, with that steady, unhurried attention that she had come to think of as one of his most distinctive qualities. "I will not pretend I do not think about it," he said. "What it means. For us. I am not going to do that. I think you deserve someone who tells you the truth about what they are thinking." "Yes," she said. "But I also think," he said, "that you have been through enough in the past year, that what you need right now is not another man presenting you with a set of feelings and asking you to figure out what to do with them. What you need is someone who is going to sit here with you and not ask you to manage anything." She looked at him. "So that is what I am doing," he said, "if you want." She exhaled slowly. "Yes," she said, "that is what I want." He stayed. They did not talk much more that evening. They sat in the healing wing while the lamp burned and the night got quiet outside, and that was enough, which was its own kind of answer. The formal recognition happened 3 months later. In their world, a chosen partnership, one that was not a fated bond but was a deliberate, declared commitment, had to be presented to the Pack Council and signed by the Alpha King. This was not a ceremony in any glamorous sense. It was a legal declaration and a pack record, but it was real, and it was permanent, and it had to happen in front of witnesses. Serafina and Caden presented themselves to the council on a cold morning in late winter. She wore her own clothes this time. A dark blue coat she had bought with 3 months of saved wages, and a pair of boots that actually fit. She had done her hair herself, pinned back simply. She looked exactly like herself, which was the point. Caden stood next to her, close enough that their arms touched. He was calm in the way he was always calm, that deep, settled steadiness that she had come to think of as one of the most underrated qualities a person could have. Darien was at the head of the council table, as he always was. He looked at them when they entered. He did not look away. The council conducted its process. The formal questions were asked and answered. The paperwork was laid out on the table. The Alpha King's signature was required to finalize it, as it always was for any formal pact declaration. Darian signed it. He did not hesitate. He picked up the pen and signed his name clearly at the bottom of the page, and he put the pen down, and he looked at the table for a moment, and then he looked at Serafina. She met his eyes. She held them for a moment. Then she gave him a small nod. Not apologetic, not triumphant, just human, person to person, the acknowledgement of something real that had happened between them and its conclusion. He gave her the smallest nod back. Then the council was dismissed, and Serafina and Caden walked out into the winter morning together, their breath making small white clouds in the cold air, and Caden reached over and took her hand, and she let him, and they walked back to the healing wing, because she had work to do, and so did he, and that was how it was. Darian went back to his chambers after the council. He sat down. He was a man who did not often sit without purpose, but he sat without purpose for quite a while. His marriage to Isadora had been dissolved by mutual agreement 2 months earlier. Isadora had asked for it, precisely and without drama, one evening over a meal. She had said that she respected him enormously and wished him nothing but what was right for him, and that she thought they both deserved to stop performing a marriage they were not actually having. He had said that he agreed. They had shaken hands, which struck them both as slightly absurd, and they had parted without hostility and with a genuine mutual respect that their marriage had never quite achieved. The Western Alliance had survived the dissolution. It turned out that after 2 years of functional partnership, the mountain passes were less conditionally offered than they had originally been. People sometimes surprised you that way. So Darian was alone. Not unhappily exactly. He was used to being alone in the essential sense, the internal aloneness that had been his longest companion. But he was aware of it in a new way, the way you become aware of a chair's absence when you reach back to sit, and it is not there. He thought about what Serafina had said to him at the Eastern camp, that forgiveness and returning were not the same thing. He had been thinking about it, on and off, for months. He understood it now in a way he had not fully understood it when she said it. It was not that she was punishing him. It was not that she lacked compassion for the position he had been in. It was that she had become someone, in the year since that night, who had outgrown the version of herself that would have waited for him to change his mind. She had not been waiting, she had been living, and the life she had built in that time had no space in it, shaped like his regret. He sat with that for a while, and then, slowly, he reached for the stack of correspondence on his desk, and he started working through it, because there was a territory to run, and people who depended on him to get things more right than wrong, and because the particular pain of understanding something too late did not excuse you from your responsibilities. It only added weight to them. He changed some things after that, not dramatically. Darian was not a dramatic man, but he changed them. The culture of the palace, which had been built in his image, tended toward calculation and reserve, and the undervaluing of anything that looked like softness. He had built it that way because he had believed, for most of his life, that softness was weakness. He understood now that this was wrong, not in a simple way, not in the way of a man who reads one thing and immediately reverses course, but in the slow, expensive way of a man who has paid in full for the error and now has no more interest in repeating it. He began to hold different kinds of council sessions, ones where people were asked what they actually thought, rather than what they calculated he wanted to hear. He reviewed the laws around fated mate rejection, which had technically allowed what he had done, but had never accounted for the human cost of it. He did not rewrite them for sentimental reasons. He rewrote them because the old version was bad policy, which it was. He was different, was the thing. Not unrecognizable, not soft in the way that would have made him ineffective, but genuinely different in the ways that mattered. The people who worked closely with him noticed, and did not say so directly, because you did not say so directly to an alpha king, but they noticed. The first real conversation between Darian and Caden after the recognition ceremony happened 3 weeks later, not because either of them had been avoiding it exactly, but because they were both the kind of men who needed to find the right moment before they spoke about something that mattered, and the right moment had not arrived until now. They were in the Eastern training yard, which was where they had always gone when they needed to talk without the palace listening. They had done their sparring, which was something they had done together since they were teenagers, and they were sitting on the low stone wall at the edge of the yard cooling down, and Caden said, without preamble, "I need to know you are all right." Darian looked at him sideways. "Why would I not be all right?" "Because you signed those papers with your own hand, and did not flinch, and I know you well enough to know that not flinching does not mean not feeling it." Darian was quiet for a moment. The training yard was empty in the early morning. The stone wall was cold even through the fabric of his jacket. "I am all right," he said. Then, after a pause, "I am not going to pretend it was easy, but I want you to know that when I signed it, I meant it. Not because I do not still carry something about what happened, but because what she said to me at the Eastern camp was true. You showed up. I did not. The paperwork reflects that, and it should." Caden said nothing for a moment. "I need you to know something," Caden said, finally. "I did not plan this. I did not go after her because of what you did, or to prove anything, or for any reason other than that she is who she is, and I was paying attention. I need you to know that because you are my oldest friend, and I would rather have that conversation with you than have it sit unspoken between us for the rest of our lives." "I know," said Darian. "I know you. If I had thought for a second it was anything other than genuine, we would have had a very different conversation much earlier." He paused. "She is fortunate in what she has. I mean that honestly. She deserves someone who shows up. She always did." Caden looked at him. "Are we all right?" Darian asked. He said it in the direct, slightly uncomfortable way he said things he was not entirely sure how to say, which was rare enough that it meant something. Caden thought about it genuinely, which was the right thing to do. "We have to rebuild," he said. "Not start over, but rebuild. What we have is real, and it is worth that work. But it will take some time to find the right shape of it." "I know," said Darian. "I have time." They sat on the cold stone wall for a while longer, not saying much else, which was also all right. Some friendships are built on the ability to be uncomfortable together without letting it become a wall, and theirs, despite everything, was that kind. The months that followed were, for Serafina, the first time she had ever had a clear sense of herself from the outside. Not through anyone else's description of her, but through the daily accumulation of her own choices and what those choices built. She woke up in the mornings and she knew what she was for. She went to work and the work was meaningful. She came home to someone who looked at her like she was the most interesting person he had ever sat in a room with, which she found both touching and slightly exasperating in the best possible way. She also discovered, in that period, that healing worked differently when you were not healing from something yourself. For the first year after the ceremony, her gift had been fueled in part by a kind of quiet desperation, the need to matter to something, to be useful in ways that could not be rejected. Now she healed from a different place, from fullness rather than emptiness, and it was both harder and easier. Harder because she was no longer being carried by urgency. Easier because she had more of herself to give. There was a boy who came in one morning in early spring, maybe 10 years old, who had been brought in by his father after a fall that had left his shoulder in a condition the camp healer could not fully address. The father was a farmer from one of the outer settlements, and he had ridden 2 days to get there, which you could see in his face, the exhaustion and the worry that had set in overnight and had not lifted. Serafina worked on the boy for an hour. The shoulder was complicated. She did what she could conventionally first, methodically, and then she did the other thing, and the boy, who had been very brave and very still the whole time, fell asleep while she was working, which meant the pain had lifted enough for his body to relax. The father sat in the corner of the room with his hands clasped together and watched. When it was done, and she told him the shoulder would heal cleanly and fully, he looked at her with the particular expression of a person who has been braced for the worst for so long that good news takes a moment to land. Then he put his face in his hands, and his shoulders moved. She sat down across from him and did not say anything for a moment, because sometimes what a person needs first is to be allowed to feel it. Eventually she said, "He is going to be fine. He will need to rest it for 3 weeks and not carry anything heavy for 6. After that, he should have full use of it." The father lifted his head. His eyes were red. How much do I owe you?" "Nothing," she said, the way she always said it to the people who could not afford it, which she could tell at a glance, and which she had never once gotten wrong. He started to argue. She cut him off gently. "Nothing. Get your boy home. Keep the arm in a sling. Come back in a month if anything worries you." She stood up and handed him the written instructions she had already prepared, which she always had ready because people in shock do not retain instructions spoken to them. He took the paper. He looked at it. He looked at her. "Thank you," he said, and the two words carried the full weight of 2 days of riding and a night of fear and the relief of a man who nearly lost something small and irreplaceable and was now carrying it home safe. "That is why I am here," she said, and she meant it in every sense it could mean. That evening she told Caden about the boy, and he listened the way he always listened, with his full attention on her face, and when she finished he said, "You know what your mother would think." "She would think I needed to get more sleep," Serafina said. "After that," she smiled, "she would think I was exactly where I was supposed to be." "Yes," said Caden, "she would be right." The difficult conversation between Serafina and Darian, the final one, the one that closed the last open door between them, happened in the Healing Wing Garden in late summer. It was not planned. These things rarely are. He had come to the Healing Wing because one of his council members had been treated there for a foot injury, and Darian had come to check on him personally, which was the kind of thing he did more often now. The small personal checks that he had previously considered beneath the attention of an Alpha King and now understood were exactly the kind of thing an Alpha King should be paying attention to. The council member was fine. On his way out, Darian passed the small walled garden that Serafina had planted at the south side of the wing. She was there, kneeling in the dirt, planting something in a patch of afternoon sun. She was wearing work clothes, her hair tied back, dirt on her hands, and one streak of it across her left cheek that she was apparently not aware of. She looked up when she heard footsteps and saw who it was and did not look away. He stopped at the garden gate. "I will not interrupt," he said. "You are not interrupting," she said. "These are just herbs. They are patient." He came through the gate and stood at the edge of the garden, looking at what she was doing in a way that was genuinely curious, rather than pretending to be. "What are they?" "Coltsfoot and yarrow, both good for wounds. Coltsfoot takes 3 years to establish properly, which means I am planting it for whoever uses this space after me as much as for myself." She sat back on her heels. "My mother always said a healer who only plants fast things is a healer who is not thinking far enough ahead." She sounds like she was remarkable. "She was," Serafina said simply. She brushed the soil off her hands. "She would have had opinions about you, I think. Good ones or bad ones. She did not really deal in those categories. She would have looked at you very carefully for about 5 minutes and then said something entirely accurate about you that you were not ready to hear." "That sounds terrifying." "She was, a little." Serafina smiled at the memory, and it changed her face the way it always did, sudden and unguarded. "But she was also the kindest person I have ever known. Those two things are not contradictory." Darian looked at her, not in the calculating way he had looked at most things for most of his life, but in a different way, quieter, the way you look at something you have finally stopped trying to categorize. "I hope you know," he said, "that what I am doing with the territory, the changes, the policy reviews, the way the councils run now, I am not doing that to impress anyone. I am doing it because I should have done it years ago, and I understand that now." "I know," she said. "I can tell the difference. I just wanted you to know that I know it too." She looked at him steadily. "Darian," she said, and it was the first time she had used his name directly, without a title, and he noticed. "You do not need my permission to become a better person. You do not owe me an explanation for it. Just keep doing it because it is right. That is enough." He stood there for a moment in the afternoon sun with the smell of turned earth and herbs around them, and something in him settled, finally and properly, in a way that had been trying to settle for a long time. "Thank you," he said. She nodded. "Go and check on your council member. He will want to know you came yourself." He did, and walking back to the main palace, He passed the new sign on the healing wing entrance, the one that read Healer Sovereign in plain carved letters, and he stopped and looked at it for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and then he continued on his way. A year passed, more than a year. Serafina's healing wing was now a full sanctuary. She had built it from a single room and 2 apprentices to a wing with 12 beds and a staff of 6, and a reputation that had spread across 2 territories. People came from far away, not just pack members, humans, people from outside the territory who had heard about the healer with the impossible gift and made long journeys on the chance that she could help them. She could not always. She had learned that too. Her gift was real, but it was not infinite, and she had learned, painfully, that trying to extend it past its limit helped no one and hurt her badly. She had learned to say, "This is what I can do, and this is what I cannot," and both of those truths were equally important. She had been offered a title 3 times. She had declined all 3. The 4th time, the council proposed a new designation, one that had not existed before: Healer Sovereign. Not a political title, not a rank within the pack hierarchy, a standalone recognition, an acknowledgement that what she did existed outside the usual structures and could not be filed within them. She thought about it for 2 days and then accepted, not because she needed the recognition, because the title came with resources and authority for the healing wing that she could not get any other way, and the resources and authority would help people, which was what she was there for. Caden was there the morning she accepted. He stood in the doorway of the healing wing when she came back from the council chamber, still in her blue coat, and she said, "They called me Healer Sovereign," with the particular tone of someone who finds something both slightly absurd and entirely right. "That is what you are," he said. "It is a lot of words," she said. "You are worth a lot of words." She made a sound that was almost a laugh. That was smooth. "I am occasionally smooth," he said, entirely calmly. She laughed properly then, and the sound of it went down the corridor and out into the courtyard where 2 apprentices heard it and exchanged a look and went back to their work. Darian walked past the healing wing on the same route every week. He was not thinking about it, or rather, he told himself he was not thinking about it, which was approximately the same quality of self-deception he had been practicing for some years on various related subjects and had never been particularly good at. He always walked at the same time of day, late afternoon, when the light through the eastern windows of the palace turned the stone corridors a particular shade of amber. He walked past the healing wing on his way to the weekly territorial review meeting, and sometimes he could hear voices inside, the low, focused sound of people doing careful work. He never stopped. He never looked in. He kept walking. But sometimes he paused at the corner just past the door, 1 beat too long, before he continued. Nobody pointed this out to him. People who had been working closely with him for years understood that there were certain things you did not point out to an Alpha King, especially when those things were the kind of things that were already costing him more than enough. There is a particular kind of love story that does not end with the lovers together. It ends with people changed. It ends with a better understanding of what it means to choose and what it costs when you do not. It ends not with a reunion but with 2 separate lives that are both fuller and more honest than they would have been if none of it had happened. That is this story. Serafina and Caden built something real. Not a fairy tale, not perfect. Something real, which is harder than either of the other 2 things and considerably more valuable. They argued sometimes, usually about small things, once about a very large thing that took 3 days to resolve, and when they resolved it, something in their foundation became more solid than it had been, the way a bone that breaks and heals comes back stronger at the break. She kept her blue mug and her plant on the windowsill and her shelf of books. These were small things, and she had learned, from the kind of losses that teach you this lesson properly, that small things are not small things at all. She kept them carefully. Darian kept running his territory. He got better at it, which is not nothing. He got better at listening, which is harder than it sounds, and at recognizing that the people around him were worth more than their function in his calculations. He did not fall apart. He was not a man built for falling apart. He became, slowly, quieter in a different way than he had been quiet before. Less the quiet of a man who has cut off access to things. More the quiet of a man who has learned to sit with things he cannot change, and find his way to peace with them, which is a kind of work that never really ends but gets more manageable over time. He never took another mate. Not because he was waiting. He stopped waiting. He simply had not found, in the particular way that finding goes when you are not looking, anyone he wanted to build something with in the real sense of wanting, not the calculating sense. He left that possibility open. He did not close doors. On the one-year anniversary of the formal recognition ceremony, Serafina sat in the healing wing after her last patient had been seen. It was evening. The apprentices had gone home. The wing was quiet in the way it got quiet at the end of a good day, the kind of tired that comes from having done the thing you are supposed to do. She thought about the night in the great hall. She thought about it the way you think about something that happened to someone you used to be, someone you remembered clearly but no longer were. The 23-year-old woman in the borrowed dress, adjusting the shoulder that would not sit right, the warmth in her sternum, the 12 steps to the door. She thought, that woman would not recognize this office. She would not recognize the 12 beds, and the 6 staff, and the title on the door. She might not recognize me. And then she thought, she would recognize the hands. The hands are the same. They just know more now. She looked at her hands in her lap, the ones that had closed wounds no one else could close, the ones that had held Cadens in the dark of the field tent, the ones that had grown up watching her mother use them in exactly the same way. She thought, I did not become this because of what happened that night. I became this in spite of it, and through it, and beyond it. The hurt was real. The building was also real. Both things can be true. She turned off the lamp. She put on her coat. She walked out of the healing wing into the evening courtyard, where the first winter stars were appearing above the palace walls, cold and clear and very far away. Caden was waiting outside the gate, as he often was on evenings when she worked late. He was standing with his coat collar turned up against the cold, looking at the same stars she was looking at, and he turned when he heard her footsteps. "Good day," he asked. "Good day," she said. She took his arm. "The boy from the northern settlement, the one with the fever that would not break, he is better. Sat up today and asked for food. That is the best kind of news." "Yes," she said. They walked toward the east gate together, their breath making white clouds in the cold. "It is." And that, honestly, was enough. Not because the story did not cost anything. It cost a great deal. It cost Serafina 3 days of pain in a hospital bed and many more months of rebuilding. It cost Caden the easier version of his friendship with Darian, which had to be renegotiated from the ground up and took time and honesty and a few very difficult conversations before it found its new shape. It cost Darian something he would carry in some form for the rest of his life, which is what happens when you make a choice you cannot unmake and live long enough to understand it fully. But what grew in the space that the cost cleared was real. A woman who knew the full extent of what she could do and had built a place to do it. A man who had learned to say the true thing instead of the careful one. A territory that was, slowly, becoming a better place to live in than it had been before. And somewhere in a stone corridor of the palace, one quiet step taken, and then another, a king who was learning, late and expensively, what it meant to be human. That is not a fairy tale. Fairy tales end differently. This ends the way real things end. Not at a finish line. In the middle of an ordinary evening, coat on, cold air, someone you trust beside you, walking home. Which, if you have ever had it, you already know, is not a small thing at all.